creative process for every movie and every filmmaker is different, but it's often said that screenwriters should write what they know because it'll bring an undoubtable honesty to the material. And yet sometimes inspiration comes from the most unexpected of places, ensuring that audiences won't ever be able to figure out how these filmmakers came up with these terrific and memorable scenes. Sometimes it's a case of a writer translating their own personal horrors into an elevated antagonist on screen. Maybe they paraphrased an iconic line from another artistic medium entirely, or they could have even just scoured the depths of YouTube in the quest for authenticity. These are just a few examples of the hugely unexpected influences behind these largely unforgettable movie scenes, each of which has a wonderfully strange and left-field origin story. In some instances, it was mere good fortune that things happened as they did, while in others, the filmmakers smartly employed their media literacy to influence the current projects they were working on. Looking at these scenes though, you'd almost certainly never guess where these ideas came from. So with that in mind then, I'm Ellie with What Culture, here with 10 unexpected inspirations behind movie scenes. Number 10. The writer's Crohn's disease inspired the chestburster scene in Alien. Alien's chestburster scene is one of the most unforgettable moments in cinema history, when Paul Kane learns the hard way that he's been impregnated with a xenomorph, which promptly explodes out of his chest at dinner. Though the scene feels horrifyingly otherworldly, it's also so viscerally disturbing that it almost feels as though it had to be inspired by something tangible, right? And that's absolutely the case, as Alien writer Dan O'Bannon mentioned numerous times that the chestburster scene was written as an homage of sorts to his experiences of living with Crohn's disease, an inflammatory bowel condition. O'Bannon suffered with this then undiagnosed illness while writing Alien, and later described the digestion process as something bubbling inside struggling to get out. And so, O'Bannon's real-life gastrointestinal discomfort laid the groundwork for one of the most brilliantly horrific scenes we've ever seen. Sadly, complications from Crohn's disease claimed O'Bannon's life in 2009. Number 9. You Talking to Me was inspired by Bruce Springsteen's stage banter in Taxi Driver. Arguably the single most iconic moment from any Martin Scorsese film is the "You Talking to Me" scene from Taxi Driver, where embattled cabbie Travis Bickle stares in the mirror and utters the phrase while imagining a scenario that would allow him to draw his gun. Yet the dialogue wasn't included in Paul Schrader's script and was, according to Schrader himself, improvised by De Niro. Hilariously, Schrader said, "It's the best thing in the movie and I didn't write it." But in the 2009 memoir of late saxophonist Clarence Clemons, Clemons said that De Niro explained the exact origins of the phrase while they filmed Scorsese's movie New York, New York together in 1977. According to Clemons, De Niro cribbed the line from none other than Bruce Springsteen, after hearing him say the line on stage to the crowd during a concert. Bootleg copies of Springsteen's 70s gigs confirm that he did have a habit of saying "You Talking to Me" while performing the tune Quarter to Three, so there's not much reason to disbelieve this one. Number 8. A Taylor Swift meme inspired the screaming goats in Thor: Love and Thunder. Love 'em or hate 'em, Thor: Love and Thunder's screaming magical goats, Tooth Gnasher and Tooth Grinder, are one of the film's biggest and most memorable recurring jokes. But Taika Waititi didn't come up with the gag entirely on his own. He got some help from his post-production team and a legendary viral remix of Taylor Swift's 2012 hit tune I Knew You Were Trouble. Waititi said, "They were never meant to be screaming. The goats were always going to be in there because they're in the comics, but we didn't know how they would sound. Then someone in post-production found this meme of a Taylor Swift song that has screaming goats in it. I didn't even know that existed. So I hear the screaming goats and I just felt it was awesome. A lot of people think it's me screaming. It's not." So, to clarify, the screaming gag wasn't in the film's script and Waititi simply added it in post-production as a whim. Does that somehow make it even worse? Number 7. An Uncle Scrooge comic inspired the boulder scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark. As ridiculous as it might sound, the iconic boulder trap from Raiders of the Lost Ark, in which Indiana Jones is almost flattened by it after retrieving a golden idol, is actually inspired by a most unlikely of source material, one of Carl Barks' Uncle Scrooge comics. More specifically, the action beat was lifted pretty blatantly from the 1954 issue The Seven Cities of Cibola, where the Beagle Boys similarly pinch a golden idol and inadvertently set off a boulder trap that they must then avoid. George Lucas and Steven Spielberg have repeated over the years that Indiana Jones was inspired by classic adventure serials of the 1930s and 1940s, but in this case they also paid sly homage to a comic that at least one of them presumably read as a child. Number 6. A viral video of an extremely drunk man inspired the Quaaludes scene in The Wolf of Wall Street. Our second of 3 Martin Scorsese entries now with The Wolf of Wall Street. Surely the single funniest scene in the movie involves stockbroker protagonist Jordan Belfort chugging some Quaaludes and then attempting to reach his car while extremely impaired. It's a masterful physical performance from Leonardo DiCaprio that arguably secured him an Oscar nomination. And in order to convincingly play a massively intoxicated human being, he went to the place most of us frequent every single day of our lives: YouTube. DiCaprio watched a viral video called Drunkest Guy Ever, which consists of convenience store surveillance footage of a wasted customer trying in vain to purchase more beer. DiCaprio claimed that he studied not only the man's elasticated movements, but also his sheer perseverance of will to try and acquire those precious beers. The brilliance of the end result speaks for itself, and hopefully that drunk guy, wherever the hell he is today, knows that he helped DiCaprio deliver an Oscar-nominated performance. Number 5. The Godfather inspired Jabba the Hutt's death in Star Wars Return of the Jedi. One of the most satisfying moments in Return of the Jedi sees Jabba the Hutt strangled to death by Leia, who uses her own slave chain to squeeze the life out of him. After writer Lawrence Kasdan suggested Jabba's death at Leia's hands, Lucas settled on the method of strangulation as an homage to The Godfather, where mob enforcer Luca Brasi, himself a portly, bug-eyed individual, is brutally garroted. In both death scenes, the blocking and camera placement, namely the focus on the life draining from their bulging eyes, is very similar, though Jabba's death proves considerably less objectionable to children given his more grotesque inhuman status. With Lucas and Godfather director Francis Ford Coppola having been close friends for years by the time this movie was made, he seemingly couldn't resist but pay sneaky tribute to one of the most memorable moments from his pal's crime opus. Number 4. Teddy's nightmare is inspired by Scandic folklore and a Klimt painting in Shutter Island. By far one of the most memorable and unsettling scenes in Martin Scorsese's Shutter Island is the nightmare sequence in which Teddy sees a vision of his dead wife Dolores turning to ash in his arms, Dolores having died in a fire previously. The scene has some unexpected influence indeed. 2 of them, in fact. Firstly, Dolores' ashen figure and hollowed-out back are reminiscent of 2 figures from Scandic folklore, the forest creatures Skogstrå and Huldra, whose backs also resemble hollowed-out trees. And then there's the striking visual of Teddy holding Dolores as she turns to ash. It's extremely similar to Gustav Klimt's early 20th century painting The Kiss. Both the pose and Dolores' yellow dress are very clearly staged and framed the same way. Though Scorsese clearly has one of the keenest eyes in the business, even he isn't above borrowing from evocative works of art that preceded him. Number 3. The answering machine scene is influenced by a Jeff Garlin show in Swingers. It's practically impossible for anyone who's seen Doug Liman's Swingers to forget the brilliantly excruciating scene in which Mike leaves a series of increasingly anxious answering machine messages for a woman he just met, only for her to eventually pick up the phone and tell him to never call again. As much as you might assume this came purely from the mind of Jon Favreau, who also wrote the film, he was actually inspired by Jeff Garlin's one-man show, I Want Someone to Eat Cheese With. Favreau worked as an usher for the Second City, a comedy troupe Garlin was a part of at the time, and heard Garlin tell a story about a love-struck answering machine message he left for a woman, only for her to play the message back in front of him and a dozen other people at a gathering. This served as the foundation for Swingers' own answering machine scene, and though Garlin noticed the inspiration himself, he had no ill will against Favreau, citing his own tendency to lift from comedians he admires. Number 2. The climax was James Cameron's literal nightmare in The Terminator. Is there a single image more associated with the Terminator franchise than the T-800's terrifying endoskeleton as it emerges from the fiery wreckage of a truck and continues to pursue Sarah Connor and Kyle Reese? It was in fact the very first image that writer-director James Cameron came up with for the movie. Yet it wasn't a light bulb moment during a creative brainstorm, but rather an involuntary image conjured during a fever dream. In a recent interview, Cameron confirmed that he came up with the T-800 design while horribly sick with a fever in Italy. He said, "The Terminator came from a dream that I had while I was sick with a fever in a cheap pensione in Rome in 1981. It was the image of a chrome skeleton emerging from a fire. When I woke up, I began sketching on the hotel stationery." And much as Cameron might have dreaded the fever at the time, it ultimately ended up laying the groundwork for the rest of his career, setting in motion the Terminator franchise and every blockbuster gig he scored off the back of it. Had Cameron not suffered through this fever dream, who knows what he'd be doing right now. Number 1. Wilbur's wall of clippings was inspired by Tim Burton's mother in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Love it or hate it, Tim Burton's singular take on Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is aggressively the director's own vision, enough that one small sliver of visual storytelling was inspired by his own personal turmoil at the time. For his version of the story, Burton and co-writer John August came up with a character not in Roald Dahl's novel, Willy Wonka's father, Dr. Wilbur Wonka. Much of the story focuses on Willy reconciling a fraught past with his domineering father, and near film's end, Charlie finds a series of newspaper clippings celebrating his success adorning the walls of his father's home. This was a very personal flourish from Burton, who had a difficult relationship with his own parents, and upon visiting his dying mother at her home in 2002, found framed posters of all his movies on the wall. On the movie's director's commentary, Burton said, "I think all artistic endeavours are a way to resolve things, a form of therapy, a fantasy of resolving something. That's why I chose to resolve it that way." And like that, a mildly poignant moment became something intensely meaningful. And that concludes our list. If you think we missed any, then do let us know in the comments below. And while you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe and tap that notification bell. Also, head over to Twitter and follow us there. And I can be found across various social medias just by searching Ellie Littlechild. I've been Ellie with What Culture. I hope you have a magical day, and I'll see you real soon.